From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on Can TV. I'm Ken Davis, and we're glad you're with us again today. So if you went to work today, how'd you get there? Did you drive? Did you drive in a single occupancy vehicle? I did. I paid the price for it today. I drove on the Kennedy and the Dan Ryan and got caught in some kind of horrendous jam up down on 18th Street and was sitting there thinking, this is the most ironic thing in the world. Here I am about to go to Can TV to talk about traffic and transportation issues, and I'm caught up in this. If I had been on the blue line, of course, I would have been here 20 minutes earlier, but there you are. Except you can't get here on the blue line. But anyway, we'll get to that later. John Greenfield, welcome to the show. Glad to have you here.
It's good to be here.
It's John's first time on the show, and we're happy to have you here. John writes in the Chicago Reader, as I guess we call you the transportation writer for the Reader. Is that right?
Correct.
And also, of course, with the it just went out of my head.
Streetsblog Chicago.
Streetsblog Chicago, right. Anyway, so we've got a guy here who knows about these things, and I'm really happy that he does, because he can help me out. This is a good day for us to be talking, because it was a huge day in the City Council yesterday for transportation.
Right. So yesterday, the City Council unanimously passed a few ordinances to approve a North Side Transit Tax Increment Financing District to help fund the red and purple modernization project, which is a $2.3 billion project proposed by the CTA, which would rebuild tracks and upgrade signals, rebuild stations between Belmont and Howard on the north side, and would also create the controversial $325 million Belmont flyover.
Okay, we got to take all of this a little bit
in
little nibbles here.
We'll discuss it more.
What's interesting about this is that when you read or hear about this, it just sounds like just some kind of boring infrastructure thing. You know, a million here, a billion here, a mile here. But this is big. I mean, I consider the red line to be, I mean, it really is kind of the spine of the city. It's just such a vital piece of the city.
That's what Emmanuel said yesterday, the spine. He's called it the backbone. But yeah, it's true. I mean, if you're going to improve any line in the city that would have an impact on, you know, a huge number of Chicagoans, it would be the red line, because it runs all the way to the Evanston border to 95th Street, and now the city is working on extending it to 130th Street to the Altgeld Gardens area. And so, you know, this project is going to have a huge impact. It also affects the purple line, which of course goes all the way up to Wilmette. You know, Emmanuel pointed out yesterday, after the ordinances passed, that I think he said 39% of Chicagoans ride the red line on a regular basis. So improving service on the red line is going to have a huge impact on improving quality of life.
Yeah.
And not just for Northsiders, but all Chicagoans.
And I mean, as we know, there are those of us who've lived in Rogers Park at various times can tell you that you know it's decrepit. I mean, the area north of Loyola all the way up to Evanston is just, it hasn't had really much improvement done on it in 100 and something years. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I mentioned before, but the project is also going to rehab 4 stations that are really totally outdated. I think it's Lawrence, Argyle, Bryn Mawr, and one other one that, you know, like you said, they've been about the same for 100 years. Yeah. They're not wheelchair accessible. They're just not very pleasant stations to use. So this is going to really improve customer experience. And, you know, it's a big problem that I think it's a third of the stations in the CTA system are not accessible to people with disabilities. So that's something we need to address. That's we're one of those, what they call them, legacy systems, right?
Yeah.
Which is a nice, polite, bureaucratic word for old.
And that's what the grant that the city is lined up to get from the federal government is all about. It's a relatively new program called the Corp Capacity Grant Program, and it's for making improvements, capacity improvements to legacy systems. So we're lined up to get a $1.1 billion grant
which will fund almost half of this massive $2.3 billion project.
Okay, so let's talk politics here for a moment. This happened in such an incredible hurry yesterday. I mean, they had a sort of an extra edition of the city council, a special meeting of the city council, just to pass the legislation to create the TIF district, so they could then turn around and call Washington and say, we did it, right? I mean, what was this deadline that they were so crazy about?
Yeah, I mean, the situation sort of calls to mind that last scene in the Blues Brothers, where, you know, right. Jake and Elwood, like, crash into the Daily Center, and they take the stairs upstairs to, like, pay the taxes for their school before it gets shut down. It was that same sort of crisis mentality.
Yeah.
So the deal is the deadline for applying.
A good analogy. I like that. Yeah.
For applying for this $1.1 billion federal grant was the same day that they had this hearing, November 30th, and so they passed this in City Council, and then Emanuel said, "I'm going to keep my comments short because I need to let CTA President Dorville Carter call the feds immediately and let them know we got this done." Yeah. It looks pretty clear that the federal government is going to give us this grant, and they're going to award it by January 15th, which is 5 days before Trump comes to office. Right. Because, like, all bets are off when Trump becomes president in terms of transit funding.
But they were very politic about saying, no, this has nothing to do with President Trump.
Exactly.
This is just because we know that things slow down when administrations change.
Even if Hillary had been elected.
Right, with same thing. But no, it was like, we got to get this done before Trump gets in there, I'm sure. I mean, we don't really know, do we? Well, we're among billions who are saying the same thing. Nobody knows what a Trump administration is going to be, but in terms of transit, it's really hard to figure out where he's going to be on that.
Well, we kind of do know what a Trump administration is going to be like on transit, if he can get away with it, because the Republican platform literally calls for having no federal funding for transit. The platform...
That wasn't what I was talking about. I wasn't talking about the Republican platform. I was talking about the guy who got elected.
Yeah, but I mean, if he's going to ally with this, I mean, they specifically say we don't want to have any federal funding for transit or anything else, basically, that's not driving trucks or cars.
But can a guy who grew up in New York City, can he be anti-transit? Even Donald Trump, can he be anti-transit?
That's the hope some transportation advocates have, that, because he was born and raised in Queens, he has some, innate appreciation for the importance of trains and buses. Let's keep our fingers crossed that has some influence.
Yeah.
I
mean, he, as we know, takes his limo down Fifth Avenue every day to get to his office, right? And he has to understand that he can actually drive to the front door of his building, because down below the street there are 1 million people on trains who are not driving cars. And what a wonderful tribute New York City is to transit, in the fact that most people don't drive cars. They ride the train.
Yeah, but I don't think we can assume that that's going to positively influence Trump, because his political base...
I tried, okay?
No. I mean, that's one hopeful thing. Another hopeful sign is that, or at least it wasn't terrible news, because some of the people that Trump had in the running for the U.S. to be the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Transportation were really anti-transit people. There was a woman from the Reason Foundation who had specifically said we should not use federal funds for transit, and who also was a big proponent of building new tolled highways. So anyway, Trump just picked Elaine Chao, who's married to Mitch McConnell, who's one of my least favorite politicians, but Elaine seems to be a fairly reasonable person, so that's a good sign, because so many of Trump's cabinet nominees are the exact opposite person you would want.
Right. It's like putting Sarah Palin in
Scott Walker for head of labor, a fossil fuel industry lobbyist to lead the EPA.
This is not funny. I don't know why we're sitting here laughing about this.
I saw a funny headline like Trump picks El Chapo to head the Drug Enforcement Agency.
Borowitz,
But anyway, so we don't know what's going to happen with transportation under Trump. So I think the city was wise to try to get this done before Trump has a chance to cancel this.
Yeah.
And it's a huge thing. I mean, for those who were naysayers about this transit TIF,
I mean, are we really going to walk away from $1 billion in federal funding to make this huge improvement?
I guess we should actually spend a moment trying to explain this. The city had been working for a couple of years to apply for and get this grant, right? And what was it? We had to have matching money to get it, and the deadline was yesterday?
Right, to apply for the thing. So, the way the Transit TIF works, I guess we don't want to go into all the mechanics of how TIFs work, but
the number one topic.
I'll try to make a long story short. So TIFs take the additional property tax generated within a particular district and capture them into a TIF fund. Now, traditional TIFs in Chicago have been very controversial, and rightly so, because they divert money from the Chicago public schools, or at least most people would argue that they do. The Transit TIF, which was approved by the Illinois legislature earlier this year, is specifically designed to not take any money away from the public schools. And it also, 20% of the money that's left over after you give the public schools their fair share goes to other taxing bodies such as the city, the county, and the parks. So they've designated this district around the work area for the red and purple modernization project, basically from the Gold Coast to Howard, if I'm recalling correctly. And so the money that's generated will be, a portion of that will be captured. They expect that to generate $850 million over the next 35 years. And they're going to need $622 million to pay off a federal loan that they will use for matching funds for this $1.1 billion core capacity grant. And the idea is that as we improve the transit, property values will go up, and then we will capture the resulting increased property tax and use that to pay back the loan.
Right. Now, of course, there's again, now that we're out here in the weeds, barely see over these weeds, one of the controversies, of course, and it is a valid one, is that the idea of TIFs was that it was to help impoverish neighborhoods. The idea that a neighborhood that is not getting the kind of investment it can, then developers and investors will come into that neighborhood because they get the tax break and blah, blah, blah. And of course, that's the antithesis of what's going on here. Some of the highest priced property in Chicago runs along the red line. So it's hardly, I mean, pockets of it are, but for the most part, it's not an impoverished area. But I think the argument that's been made by the Emanuel administration, which I agree with, is that the red line is probably the single most important piece of infrastructure for people who live below the poverty line to get to work and to get to school.
Right.
So it may not be serving a neighborhood per se, but it's connected to the neighborhoods in Chicago where the poverty is the highest. So it's really an investment in the future and taking a piece of our most valued infrastructure and making it a lot better, which I happen to think is a great idea.
Yeah. I mean, here's why I believe that the red and purple modernization program, it's not just like a nice thing to do, it's something that we have to do, or there's going to be a really negative consequence for the city in the future. All right, the red line is, the north red line is basically at capacity during rush hours. If you ride it during rush hour, it's sardine-like conditions. There's no capacity to add extra trains right now, and the big log jam, the big bottleneck, is this area just north of the Belmont Red Line station where the brown line tracks cross the purple and red line tracks at level. And so what that means is when a northbound brown line train has to go west, just north of Belmont, it's called the Belmont Junction or something.
Clark Junction.
Clark Junction, that's it, thanks. Red and purple trains have to wait. There's basically a stop line for the other line, a stoplight for their lines. You know, and Emanuel made the mistake of promoting this as something that would be a huge time saver, just like that wait adds 3 minutes to people's commute, and that's not really true. The delay isn't that long. It's probably more like a minute on average, but it does affect how many trains can be run on those lines. So by creating the Belmont flyover, also known as the red-purple bypass, that will allow the CTA says it will allow them to run 15 more trains an hour. And
during rush hours between Belmont and Fullerton. And that's really important because the CTA projects that demand for those lines is going to double over, I think, the next quarter decade. So what that means is if conditions are already like barely tolerable on the Red Line during rush hours, things just aren't going to work in the future as the populations of the neighborhoods around the Red Line and the other lines grow in the future. And another trend we're seeing is people are driving less. Millennials are not buying cars. They've got big student loans. They're less interested in having possessions than having experiences. They're more interested in using their phones or reading while they get to work, that kind of thing.
Right.
So
with the buds in, yeah.
And a lot of transit-oriented development is being built. So a lot of the reason people choose to live in these neighborhoods is the good transit access to downtown jobs and other parts of the city.
And we shouldn't just skip over that either. This whole issue of transit-oriented development is massive, and maybe we should put a bookmark in that and
let's
remember.
Talk about that.
Because I don't want you to go before we talk about that. I think it's a huge development in Chicago. But anyway, so you've got this huge. I mean, think like, I don't know, Ashland and Irving Park or something, 79th and Ashland. You've got like a giant intersection, and everything has to stop while one train moves across it.
Right.
And it's an 8-car train, and it takes 30 seconds or something to get through that junction. But it's not just the train that's sitting waiting for that one to go by. When that train's sitting there, the train that's at Fullerton coming south is also sitting in the station waiting.
It
just backs everything up. And if you are on those trains, and I'm on them a lot, that 32 seconds or whatever it is feels like about an hour and a half when you're standing jammed in this train. And Your attention, please. We are being delayed by. Anyway.
On the other hand, it's totally understandable that there are a lot of folks in Central Lakeview who are up in arms about this project.
Yes, of course it is. Of course there are.
Because not only do some people object to the aesthetics, people have compared it to like a roller coaster. It's going to require the demolition of some 16 buildings.
Yes.
So that's huge. It's totally understandable that neighbors, people who will be directly affected by it, are against it. But sometimes you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet.
Well, I mean, this is as old as the Republic, isn't it? This question about when a piece of private property is in the way of something that is generally considered to be for the public good, then you just have to do something about it.
This is going to demolish 16 buildings to do something that's going to improve transportation in Chicago, that's going to make Chicago a healthier, safer place to get around. Right. And compared to the creation of the expressway system in Chicago, think of how many thousands of properties, how many people that displaced for something that ultimately arguably had a negative effect on the city.
I couldn't agree more. I think that is such a good point to make. And I have to say, with all due respect to the people whose lives are going to be torn up because their property is going to be taken, in 10 years, we will not be arguing about whether that was a good piece of infrastructure to build. I am convinced of that. It's not. There won't be people sitting around saying 20 or 30 or 40 years from now, "Can you believe they wasted all that time and money to build this overpass so that the Brown Line could double its?" No, it's not going to happen.
Exactly. I mean, it's controversial now. But if I was to become mayor and say, "Hey, let's tear out the entire Kennedy Expressway and let's develop that area," which actually might not be such a bad idea. If I was to do that, I would have a rebellion on my hands. People would say, "What? You're going to get rid of this major transportation corridor?" I think the same thing. People will look back and say, it was painful when we did it, but there's no way we're going to reverse this. We would never tolerate those conditions again.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it is a major story, and I guess I can't, since we've dipped into the world of politics here, because you can't separate politics from infrastructure here. I have to say that I might be the only person in Chicago who is willing to say an occasional good thing about Rahm Emanuel. And the one thing that I am willing to say is that guy has fought for transit like no mayor that I've seen before. And he's poured, billions into the system. And I think he should be congratulated for it, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, I sometimes get pigeonholed as being a pro-Emanuel person,
And that's actually not the truth. I think, and especially after the Laquan McDonald case, I think he really lost a lot of his moral authority there.
Yeah.
But I think his transportation policy has generally been very strong. And even when it comes to transportation equity, making choices that benefit people across the city, from different walks of life, I think the city has done a good job with that.
Yeah. I mean, you cannot make the argument that, as some have tried, that this is just pouring a couple of $1 billion into the north side. It's always the north side. Well, no, this is not a north side, south side thing. First of all, a lot of money was spent on the south side. They got it first, as they should have. It was that whole thing was decrepit all the way down along the Dan Ryan, and
you're talking about the South Red Line reconstruction. Right. That was a $425 million project.
Right.
Right now, they're rebuilding the 95th Street station, the Southern Terminus, which is a $280 million project, and then we got the South Red Line extension project, which it's a very fair criticism, is that really limped along for decades.
Sure
but
did.
We finally got some movement on it. In October, the city released the draft environmental impact statement for people to review. And then on Sunday, the city announced that the CTA announced they're going to spend $75 million on preliminary engineering for the project. So it's happening. We're not just spending $2 billion to redo North Side Transit, but we're also spending $2 billion to redo South Side Transit.
Do you believe at this point that it will happen? I mean, it's going to be years before it opens, before it's built. But do you think it's going to go forward?
At this point, I'm pretty sure it's going to. Now, here's a good question. Is it the smartest way to handle improving South Side Transit? I definitely sympathize with people in the neighborhoods like Alkell Gardens who have terrible transit access now, and they feel that they deserve the red line.
One bus, basically.
Yeah, extended south. I mean, I think that's a completely reasonable point of view. On the other hand, there's also a movement to create rapid transit style service on Metra's electric line, which basically serves the same neighborhoods. So it would be so much cheaper to just start running CTA style service on the electric lines. Also, the South Red Line route goes through fairly unpopulated areas. It's a lot of money to spend to provide transit access for thousands rather than hundreds of thousands of people. So, you can make an argument that maybe it would be wiser to just improve the Metro Electric. Personally, I say if we can afford it, the more transit, the better. It'd be great if we can extend the South Red Line and improve the Metro Electric.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it's been a couple of good years for transit. As a Blue Line guy, it's really nice to see all those old Kennedy stations getting redone.
Where do you live?
Oh, I'm up by Jefferson Park.
Okay.
So they haven't
Man,
done
a lot of controversy there.
Yes. Yes, there is a lot of controversy there.
That was one of the first columns I wrote for the Readers about the Jeff Park NIMBY movement.
Right. Yes, indeed. Well, let's start our tour of the Blue Line at California, shall we? Look at what's going on at California and Milwaukee, where you have, I don't know how, I've lost track of how many of these large developments there are of so-called transit-oriented development buildings. They tend to be smaller units. They tend to have fewer or maybe no garages. And they are intended for presumably younger, but not necessarily younger, but people who are transit-oriented people, right? It's a great idea. It does so much good for the city, in my humble opinion. I think it really begins to revitalize the city right in the middle, right in the guts.
Yeah, TOD, transit-oriented development, it's a huge issue. Transit-oriented development, in theory, is always a good thing. Like, as much development as possible should be transit-oriented. That is, we should build housing near transit within a 10-minute walk of transit. So it's easy for people to get where they need to go without driving. And if you're building near transit, there's no reason to build tons of parking spaces. Until recently, the city of Chicago, the default zoning was that when you build a new building, every single unit has to have a dedicated parking spot, 1-to-1 ratio. So in recent years, the city passed, in 2013, the city passed a transit-oriented development ordinance, and then they beefed it up in 2015. And as it stands now, it basically waives the parking requirement for developments within a 10-minute walk of transit.
Actually, it might be 5 minutes, 5-minute walk, 10-minute if it's on a pedestrian street, a designated pedestrian street. But at any rate, it has really sparked a lot of development, particularly on the northwest side along Milwaukee Avenue and the Blue Line corridor, which is, these neighborhoods a lot of young people want to live in, a lot of tech workers, a lot of relatively affluent people who are new to the city. And so what we're seeing is a lot of development is being built. It's all transit-oriented development, but it's also all upscale. And there's definitely this question of, is it a double-edged sword? On one hand, it's good that we got a lot of people living near the L, but these are also neighborhoods, especially like Logan Square is kind of the battleground for this issue, where they've had a gentrification and displacement issue for many years. And many activists in the neighborhood believe that these TODs are accelerating that. These are pretty expensive units. A lot of them have, might be $1,300 for a studio apartment, which is high for Chicago. And so the activists believe that that necessarily leads to higher rents, property values, and property taxes in the neighborhoods, which forces out longtime residents. We've seen a lot of Latinos leaving Logan Square. And then the counter argument made by organizations like the Metropolitan Planning Council is that increasing the amount of market rate housing in a neighborhood takes pressure off the rental market, because you got the more affluent people who are moving the neighborhood won't be competing for the same apartments. And I can kind of relate to that. I used to have a nice apartment in Logan Square. It got bought by a guy who used to run the merchandise mart. He very politely evicted me, and then he rehabbed the place and he raised the rent by 50%. So that kind of thing is happening. The question is, do these new buildings make that sort of thing more or less likely to happen?
And this argument has been going on it's been really going on for the last couple of years with fierceness. But, as I say, I live up near the Jefferson Park station, and boy, I tell you, the intensity of the battle going on up there is just amazing to watch. But you see, the difference is, part of the argument, I see it as a different argument, because the argument that I detect from Jeff Parker's is that we have a kind of suburban environment here, and we don't want multiple unit buildings around and all of these kind of transient people who claim they don't have a car but will actually be parking their car in front of our house and that kind of thing. So it's not exactly the gentrification argument that's happening 4 or 5 stations down the line. It's a different kind of argument, I think. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I mean, these people are against both, wealthier people moving into these places, and they're also against having affordable housing in them, because they don't want less wealthy people.
They don't want less wealthy people. They don't want more wealthy people, right?
It's so complicated there. Like the developer who has been proposing a lot of the stuff seems pretty sleazy, and there was the whole thing with
there's that.
The former alderman trying to take the Sportif importer store by eminent domain so that his buddy could build condos.
By the way, in case if you ever want to have a real laugh about this, drive down Lawrence Avenue just a little bit past the Kennedy and look on the south side of the street, and you'll see there's just empty lot after empty lot after empty lot. They cleared it all out about 10 years ago because they were going to build this big development. And the one guy who owns the Sportif bike shop just would not sell, and it's still there. This one little, and it just it's blessings to you. Anyway, it's a good example of what happens when somebody just will not let go, and it's what we were talking about before, actually, because this is not the same thing. They can't take the property because it's just for private development. It's not for the public good, as in building a rail line or something. Anyway, yes, the argument continues. But it is interesting to me that the latest development is almost literally within the footprint of the station. It's so close to the station. And it's very hard to argue that it changes the nature of the neighborhood around it, because it's not really in the neighborhood around it. That's my view.
Okay.
You see it differently.
Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah, it's such an interesting situation there. The same people, they killed a proposal by the city to do a road diet on Milwaukee Avenue, north of the Jeff Park station.
That's right.
John Arena, the 45th Ward alderman, is pretty sustainable transportation friendly, and the Department of Transportation wanted to convert 2 of the 4 lanes. It's actually more like a 5-lane street because it's got a turn lane to protected bike lanes. Because that street just has too much capacity, and there's a real problem with speeding and crashes. And there was just a real rebellion where one of the guy who was running against Arena in the aldermanic race showed up. He and like the local Chamber of Commerce showed up with this huge stack of petitions against doing it. So that got killed, and they didn't really make any improvements to Milwaukee's still a dangerous
those
street.
bike lanes on their Milwaukee Avenue, even though Milwaukee Avenue south of there is like a bike highway. But once you get past,
south of there, they're putting in some nice bike lanes, and they're actually doing a road diet.
Get past Lawrence Avenue, you just turn around and go back to Logan Square. That's what we say to you.
But you gotta be sympathetic to the longtime Jefferson Park folks.
Sure.
I actually, I'm trying to get away with using the term NIMBY, which means not in my backyard, because, unless I hate it when people do this kind of activism, anti-development activism anonymously. But, if people have legitimate concerns, they should be heard.
Well, I'll get off of this because I'm getting too hyper-local here, because it's a chance to talk about someplace near where I live. But what's also funny to me is that if you walk about a half a block from the Jefferson Park station, and in almost any direction, south and east and west, you'll run into this 4 or 5 block area that's almost entirely multiple unit buildings. It's there's like it's 60s era 2- and 3-story buildings, and there's probably thousands of units. So there's transit-oriented development. It was put in there in the 50s. It was put in there when the Jeff Park station was probably built in the 70s. So
transit-oriented development, it's something that used to be the norm.
Right,
we didn't call it that back then.
And this will be the last thing I say about it. I think we all, those of us who are older, who've ridden public transportation in Chicago for decades, know that for many, many years, for decades, there were stops. Let's look at the Grand Avenue stop, for example, on the Blue Line. Okay, they just shut it down because there was nothing. There was nobody using it. There was nothing there when you came up from underground. There was just nothing there. So part of the reason that this is chicken and egg. Part of the reason that there was not that much use of the Blue Line, and to some extent the Red Line, is because there was nothing, there were no people there to use it. When it starts becoming attractive and people begin to cluster around it, then everything begins, one thing fires the other. And now look at the Grand Avenue station, look at the traffic going in the Grand Avenue station on the Blue Line every day. It's one of the busiest stops on the line.
And they're building all these transit-oriented developments around there.
Right.
I mean, now we've got sort of the opposite problem, which is how crowded is the Blue Line going to get?
That's right.
And we don't have a plan to add capacity to the Blue Line yet.
No, and it would be very difficult to do because it's a little subway. So.
Except for Emmanuel's crazy plan to do a express train to O'Hara.
Well, yeah, now there, well, no. We could go on, couldn't we? Do you want to talk for a moment about President Trump's $1 trillion infrastructure plan? I mean, it just sounds so good, and even Democrats are saying, wow, maybe here's a place where we can work with the future president. But everything I'm seeing is that it's all just a gigantic bait and switch scam, but I don't know.
Yeah, the Trump's infrastructure plan is a really interesting topic. I think it's a great strategy by the Republicans to, immediately after this catastrophic news of the Trump upset in the election, then the Republicans emphasize the infrastructure plan, which is a really potentially bipartisan thing. People are suffering from PTSD after the election. They want to do something constructive. So you get Democrats like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer from New York saying, we think we might be able to work with Trump on this infrastructure plan. So Trump wants to spend $1 trillion to fix things like roads, airports, tunnels, bridges. and he actually talked about it a bit in his victory speech. And everybody agrees that we need to fix infrastructure in the United States. It's a huge problem. But there's a few reasons why I don't support the Democrats going along with this infrastructure plan. For one thing, the plan itself is really suspect. Like you said, the financing is really sketchy. It's starting to look like this isn't really a plan about fixing infrastructure. This is a plan about building more infrastructure, specifically toll roads, which we do not need highway expansion in this country. We need to be making our transportation system less car dependent, not more car dependent. We need to be focusing on building intercity rail, improving urban transportation.
Intercity rail.
Between cities. We're so far behind Europe and Asia when it comes to high-speed rail.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. And the Republicans, they want to destroy Amtrak. But anyway,
you know how heartily they laugh at you when they hear people talking about stupid ideas like intercity rail, right?
Yeah. And you know why the Republicans hate Amtrak is because it generally doesn't serve red states. Most of the places that have Amtrak stations are Democratic areas.
Yeah.
It's looking like the main thing that the Trump infrastructure plan is going to be about is building toll roads that are funded by public-private partnerships, P3s. And those are almost always bad deals. Basically, they're pitched as a way to make infrastructure pay for itself. But usually...
You live in Chicago, right?
Yeah, of course, I live in Uptown.
I don't know if you heard about this, but there was this thing a few years ago where they sold all of our parking meters to a private contractor.
Don't get me started on that. Talk about catastrophes.
And this is just what I want. Is I just want to hear somebody saying that we're going to fix the Eisenhower by selling it to some Australian magnate or something who's going to turn it into a tollway.
Yeah, P3s they're not always disastrous. Like most people feel that. Privatizing the Chicago Skyway worked out pretty well, having a private vendor run that. But we also had this plan for the Ileana Tollway, which would run south of the metropolitan area. For some reason, Pat Quinn, who's a Democrat, really was nuts about doing that plan. But that's a pretty typical tollway plan in which it's pitched to the public as saying that's going to create jobs and fight congestion. But the way the deal would have worked, the Illinois taxpayers would have been on the hook for $500 million, and to pay for that. And also, if the concessionaire would have had a guarantee that the tollway would have produced a certain amount of money, and if it didn't reach that, then taxpayers would have been on the hook for paying the remainder.
That's always part of the deal.
So these are always bad deals. Right. We just, recently there was a tollway between Austin, Texas and San Antonio that went bankrupt after getting a huge federal loan.
Yeah.
So these things are a bad idea on many levels. So I do not want to see $1 trillion spent for creating a whole lot of new tollways. And then there's the issue, the editor-in-chief of Streetsblog in New York, a guy named Ben Fried, brought up, which is like, Trump has the rest of his platform is so reprehensible. Things like banning Muslims from entering the United States, punishing women for having abortions, wide-scale racial profiling by police, and the list goes on. Mass deportations of undocumented immigrants. And do we really want to work with this guy on infrastructure before he disavows those terrible policies? Ben made the argument that if we work with him on infrastructure, if we normalize the Trump administration, that's just going to grease the skids for enacting the rest of the Trump worldview. So,
yeah. Well, and even if your politics don't take you to that place, maybe your politics take you to the place of if this just goes forward, if they just start spending this money, they could be putting our great-grandchildren on the hook for $1 trillion in debt for decades.
Yeah.
So it's weird how things have changed since when Barack Obama wanted to do a giant infrastructure project. It was roundly criticized by the Republicans, but that's just the country we live in. We were used to that by now, I guess.
Yeah, his slogan was "Fix it first," which makes a lot of sense. If we build all these new tollways, we're just going to be deeper in the hole when
Right.
it comes to maintaining our crumbling infrastructure.
And I have to say, I just don't want that point to get lost in this conversation. The solution to crumbling bridges and expressways that are beginning to pound themselves into just concrete dust and rail lines that are out of alignment and falling apart, the solution to fixing them is not building a tollway.
Right.
I mean, come on, it's not. The solution is fixing them.
But politicians, it's not as much fun to cut the ribbon on a
Nowhere
repaved
near.
road or something.
You can't have a big press event, to say that, hey, look at this, we fixed the green line.
Right.
Who cares? It's supposed to work, right? Anyway. You've written a lot, and I want to just take a few more minutes with you here, if you'll give me a couple more minutes,
Sure.
because you've written a lot about bikes and Chicago being a bike-friendly city. But in many ways, it's not a bike-friendly city. I mean, we're kind of Jekyll and Hyde about this, aren't we? We spend a lot of money putting in these protected bike lanes, and then we also make it one of the most dangerous places to ride a bike. I don't really know what we should do about it.
Yeah, I mean, the big irony was when Bicycling Magazine rated Chicago the best city for biking in the United States this year. I mean, I'm not saying that was completely undeserved. A lot of great things for biking have happened under the Emanuel administration. They've built over 100 miles of protected bike lanes. That's where you have a physical protection, like a line of parked cars, or at least some flexible plastic posts to the left of the bike lane. Built the Bloomingdale Trail, aka the 606. Created the divvy system, which is huge. I mean, that's like almost 6,000 public bikes. And they've been doing a lot of the right things to make Chicago a bike-friendly city. But the fact is, on the ground here, you got to have a fair amount of nerve to ride a bike on the streets of Chicago.
Yeah.
It's definitely not what we call an 8 to 80 city. That means having infrastructure that's safe for 8-year-olds and 80-year-olds to use.
Oh, okay, an 8 to 80 city. That's a new one. I mean.
Yeah. You have to have. You have to be kind of brave to ride.
So what
a
are we
bike
now, about a 20 to 28 city right now?
Yeah, that might be the term.
Yeah, right.
But so what do we have to do to make Chicago a truly safe city to bike? We need better enforcement of traffic laws. We got a speeding epidemic here. We got people blowing red lights, which are things that traffic cameras can address, although they've been highly controversial here, partly for good reason, because we had the red light camera bribery scandal.
Right.
We got a guy who's gone to jail for decades because
Yes,
of that. But anyway, we need to do more stuff to slow down drivers, make sure that they're obeying the 30 mile per hour default speed limit in the city, which makes a lot of sense because if a person is struck by a car at 30 miles per hour, they've got a fighting chance of surviving. Much faster than that, they're almost certainly going to die. And pavement quality is a huge issue. We need more low-stress bikeways, bike routes where people don't have to share the road with fast cars. So things like protected bike lanes, off-street trails like the Bloomingdale and the Lakefront Trail, and also these things called neighborhood greenways, which are traffic calm side streets that have various features that make them convenient to bike on.
There was one, they tried to do one of those in, 38th, where was it, just recently, and then I got killed up on the north side, I think, along those, I can't remember.
Well, it's not a sure thing yet. You're talking about Manor Avenue.
Manor, yeah.
That's in Deb Mell's ward.
Deb Mell.
That's like the Ravenswood Manor neighborhood where Blagojevich and some other politicians live.
33rd, yeah.
So yeah, Manor is this street that runs west of the Chicago River that a lot of people like to use as a shortcut. So it's got all this cut-through traffic on it. So they had proposed making it illegal to go all the way between Montrose and Lawrence on Manor, and they experimented with it by putting in some sawhorses and making it something where bicyclists can go all the way through on this road, but drivers can't. And people just freaked out about it.
Yeah.
In California, they've got these things are really common. They call them bike boulevards there.
Yeah.
And for some reason, we haven't been able to pull off traffic diverters in Chicago. Just people do not want to change their driving habits.
Well, there really is a conflict in Chicago because as somebody who drives more than I ride bikes, I'm constantly ticked off by bikers who just cut in front of my car and, you know, just really just disobey any kind of logical etiquette for riding in the street. Now, I know that that's not all bikers, but it really does cause problems. And so, you know, both sides have some really strong arguments to make against each other.
Well, here's a question for you. When you see a bicyclist do some kind of boneheaded move, is it something that's more common than drivers doing boneheaded moves? And
no,
B,
but the consequences are so much worse. If a guy,
Are they?
Yeah, I think so. If a guy cuts me off in a car, I might be offended by it, you know, whatever. But as long as our cars don't connect, and neither of us is hurt, and there's no, and it's over in a few seconds, unless you got a gun in the glove compartment or something. But that's for another show. But
so you're saying the consequences of dangerous biking
Yes.
are greater than the consequences of dangerous driving.
yeah, I'm afraid I
mean,
do
when
believe that.
when a
yeah.
bicyclist does something dangerous, they're basically only endangering themselves.
Well,
they're not-
unless
they're almost
I
certainly
have
not
the
gonna-
unless I have the bad fortune of being the guy who hits him.
but you're not going to get killed.
No, I didn't say that. But I really dread the I do live in fear sometimes along biking corridors where there's lots of bicyclists, that there's going to be that one moment where there's somebody that I don't see coming in from the side, and they're going to end up under my front wheels, and both of us are going to live with that for the rest of our lives. I consider that to be a real issue.
I definitely agree with you that, you know, whatever form of transportation you're using, whether you're walking, biking, driving, it's your responsibility to be mindful so that you don't endanger yourself or other people.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, Chicago on average, 110 people per year are killed by drivers. There is no recorded history of anyone ever being killed by a bicyclist. So
I don't
should
think
we
I
really
was talking about anybody. I wasn't really talking about bicyclists killing anybody or even hurting anybody. I was talking about them getting hurt and putting themselves into situations where they can get hurt. And when you're a driver, you're constantly worrying about that.
But I mean,
Well, I shouldn't say
is it,
constantly,
you
but
know,
you know what I
bicyclists
mean.
are conspicuous, and I'll agree with you. There are definitely some boneheaded people out there riding bikes, as well
Yeah.
as boneheaded people driving,
Yeah.
people walking in non-mindful ways. But should we really be worried about the people on 30-pound vehicles driving dangerously, or should we be worried about the people in 3,000-pound
Well,
vehicles
see,
driving
I guess
dangerously?
maybe, boy, we could go around in this one for a while, but the thing that I'm talking about is not that I'm worried about my own safety when I'm driving. I'm not the least bit worried about my own safety, even if that person gets mangled into mashed potatoes under my car. I will get out of the car and walk away, and I'll be fine. That's never been my issue. My issue is that I don't want to be a party to hurting that person. And I don't want them putting themselves in jeopardy in front of or on the side of my car. And part of it is the architecture of Chicago. You know, it's very difficult for us to coexist. And I'm all for building infrastructure where bicyclists can safely bike. I like to ride bikes too, but I'm not a bike commuter. But there you are. Anyway.
You know, I think one thing we can agree on that you hit the head on, if we want better behavior by bicyclists, building safe infrastructure is the way to do it. When they built the protected bike lane on Dearborn Street and put in dedicated stoplights for bicyclists, they found that compliance with red lights skyrocketed.
Very good point.
So
Yeah.
if we design streets so that they're safe and convenient places to bike, we're going to see better behavior by bicyclists.
You know, at the result of just sounding like the old cranky guy, like I should be like on a
No, I think your viewpoint is
the old
reasonable.
guy on cable TV. I think the biggest issue is bikers who do not believe that traffic signals are for them, that they can just simply jam their way through traffic signals anytime they want because they're on a bike, and they're certainly morally superior to me because I'm just driving this 3,000-pound thing and I'm just polluting the air and they're not.
You know, as I often say, if you're blowing through red lights on a bicycle in a way that forces drivers to slam on their brakes or forces pedestrians to stop in their tracks in order to avoid a crash, you're being a jerk. You're being a danger to yourself and others. You deserve to be ticketed.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
you know,
I'm not trying to say that this is. I don't want to make this into a bigger deal than it is.
Sure.
And already I can feel this amplifying, and it's not necessary. Anyway, you know, you wrote something the other day that I thought was really interesting because I never knew what these things were. These shields that are
side guards,
side guards on large trucks. Is that what they're for? To protect bicyclists
and pedestrians.
And pedestrians.
Yeah.
I've been seeing those things more and more where you look at like an 18-wheeler and there's this there's this kind of thing that goes almost down to the ground like a curtain or something. And I thought they were just aerodynamic or something. Maybe they're
probably good for that too.
Yeah. But they really, I never thought about that. They really can be a life and death difference to somebody who is about to get caught under those rear wheels.
Yeah, well, you know, in Chicago this year we've had 6 fatal bike crashes that happened in the city, and I think every case involved commercial vehicles. 4 of those involved, 3 of them involved flatbed trucks for making a right turn who ran over a person who was to the right of them on a bike. And side guards are designed to mitigate that kind of crash. There was also a student at Northwestern who was killed when she went under the wheels of a concrete truck. So side guards, they don't prevent crashes, but they mitigate the effects. If a truck strikes a pedestrian or bicyclist, then they keep the person from going under the wheels because it's really hard to survive if that happens. Although there was a case near here actually where, my gosh, it was right near here. It was like a block away. Did you hear about this?
On Roosevelt, yeah. Less than a block from here, yeah.
There was a young woman who was biking in a bike lane, and apparently a trucker made a illegal move, and she went under the truck, but she survived. She had to have a leg amputated, but you know, that the side guards might have prevented that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And they're actually they're required in a lot of countries.
Oh, are they?
Yeah, and they're not that expensive, so I don't understand why trucking companies wouldn't want to have these on their trucks. I mean, they save them so much money and liability.
Yeah, yeah. Well, John, it's just been so interesting sitting here talking about this. This is obviously, all this transportation stuff is a favorite of mine. I could just go on and on and on about this. So you'll have to come back. We have millions of other things to talk about, all right?
All right.
Okay. Good to meet you. And like I said, come back anytime, all right?
All right.
John Greenfield is with Streetsblog Chicago and also writes for the Chicago Reader. And you can see him all over the place. Just Google John Greenfield and you'll see his stuff. It's a very, very interesting body of work that he's put together. And you are watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a production of CAN TV. You can see any of our programs right here by going to this address anytime you like. We got about 6 years of shows there if you had any desire to watch what we were talking about. And you know what you could do? You could go back to 2013 and watch us talking about Rahm Emanuel and the red light program. That would be fun. Anyway, we'll see you again next week with another program right here. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Ken Davis. See you next time. Bye-bye.